Last year, a lot of teams were taken by surprise by the Columbus Blue Jackets, and we'll see if they can do it again this upcoming season. We're going to discuss how the Blue Jackets can continue to be the underdog on today's Locked On Blue Jackets.
You're Locked On Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster, here to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly about your favorite team and mine, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Before we get things started, I want to thank everyone for making this your first listen of the day every single day. Locked On Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms and over on YouTube. I also have to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is right around the corner, so visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now. So let's talk about last season first. And so what we're going to kind of do today is I feel like last year the Blue Jackets were much better than a lot of people expected, right? So I was like, okay, well, did that translate to, did other teams underestimate the Blue Jackets, right? So what I did was I decided to look at this specifically in terms of goaltending, because I feel like a really good way to track how much quote unquote respect a team gets from the other team is, do they get their starting goalie against them, right? So, for example, if you're playing the Rangers, do you get Igor Shesterkin? Do you have to play against Igor Shesterkin, or do you get to play against Jonathan Quick, Dylan Garand, any of the backups, right? Do you get to play against Connor Hellebuck, or do you play against Eric Comrie, right? Like, there's huge gap between goaltenders of those kind of caliber, right? Obviously, this is not as cut and dry, because a lot of teams don't have cut and dry starters. There were at least 2 or 3 teams that when I looked at them, I was like, oh, okay, this is basically a tandem. There were a lot of other teams where, who you would expect to be the starter actually didn't play a bunch this year, like Carolina, I'm looking at. For example, Freddie Anderson should have been the starter for them. And when he was on the ice, he was very, very good. Unfortunately, he was hella injured basically all season. So he didn't play. I think he played 22 games. So what I did was I took all of this and then I went through and looked at the Blue Jackets and looked at, did they play against a starter or a backup? Did they win or lose that game? And then which goalie did the Blue Jackets have in net as well? Now, I think the third thing is probably the least important, especially just because I don't know that if the other team sees that the Blue Jackets are going to start Elvis or they're going to start Tarasov or whatever, like maybe there's something in there of like, oh, if they're starting their backup, we can probably get away with starting our backup, right? Now, that's obviously not a one-to-one. I believe the away team has to submit their team sheet before the home team does, in a similar way that the home team gets the last change. So the away team has to send their guys out for a face-off first, and then the home team can decide who they want to send out in, against them. And I believe it's basically the same in terms of the home team gets to see what the away team roster is before they have to submit theirs. So obviously that's not relevant for 50% of the games here, but I wanted to note and see, okay, well, how many starters did Elvis play against? How many backups did he play against? Stuff like that. So we're going to get into that. We're going to look at what the goalie situation was like for teams facing the Blue Jackets last season. And then what I want to talk about is, will that happen again next year? If it does happen, can they take advantage of it? If it doesn't happen, like, is that a good thing? Because it means the teams are respecting them more, but they're in that weird kind of middle ground right now where I feel like obviously they're not a contender, but knock on wood, they're not a lottery team either, right? They're kind of in that mushy middle of bad teams will probably play their starters against them, good teams will probably play their backups against them, etc., etc. So let's get into the data. Because I really want to talk about it, because it took me friggin' forever to put together. But the breakdown was, and like I said, just to reiterate, I marked down whether it was a starter or a backup, what the team was, whether it was winner or loss, and which goalie the Blue Jackets started. And what I found was last season, the Blue Jackets faced a total of 37 starting goalies, 37 backup goalies, and then 6 goalies I considered a tandem goalie. So the teams that I considered tandems were Washington, because Lindgren and Thompson played basically the same amount of games. I do think that Thompson is the starter, but he played, I think, 42 and Lindgren played like 39. So I was like, you know what, that's close enough. Similarly, Pittsburgh, Tristan Jarry and Alexander Elkovich, I think, had 36 and 37 games each. So again, basically a tandem. And then I pulled Chicago as well, because they had Mrazek and Arvid Soderblom, who basically played, again, a non-zero amount of different games, but basically, like, again, I think it was like 41 and 39 or something like that. So those are the 3 teams that I kind of picked. It's like you could very easily have chosen Dallas as well. They kind of had Dallas played 700 goalies last season, but for the most part, teams had solid backup starters, right? So those are my tandems. The Blue Jackets played 6 games against what I would consider a tandem goalie, all 3 Washington games, and then Pittsburgh and Chicago as well. So after we've broken that down, I was like, okay, so what does this mean in terms of perceptions at the start of the season versus perceptions at the end of the season, right? And so I decided to break it down into the first 41 games and the last 41 games, in terms of, were they facing more starting goalies at the beginning of the season or at the end of the season? Because I feel like, again, the Blue Jackets had a weird season of, they started off okay, and then they picked it up, and then they had that big flat section in like the second third of the season, and then obviously they finished the season, on that 6 or 7 game winning streak. But what I found was, at the beginning of the season, so the first half of the season, there were 17 starting goalies, 20 backup goalies, and 5 tandem goalies. And then in the second half of the season, they actually faced 22 starters, 17 backups, and 1 tandem. So in the second half of the season, they faced way more well, not way more, but they faced, more starting goalies than they did backups, versus the first half where they faced more backup goalies than starters, which I thought was really, really interesting, quite honestly, because I think it showed that, again, the Blue Jackets kind of worked their way into that playoff spot and then hung around in that playoff spot, basically until that like mid-March meltdown, which as I was going through the games game by game, and I got to that point, I was like, oh, here we go. Here's the no good, very bad section of the season where they had like 8 shutouts in the month of March against them and forgot how to score goals entirely, and it was just real bad and not good, and essentially led to them falling out of that playoff spot. But what I found was that, again, the first half of the season, they were maybe underestimated a little bit more. They faced more starters in the back half of the season. Again, I would love to know, like, I simply did not have the time or the math to do, like, which teams kind of lent on their starting goalie more as the season went on, right? Because you got to imagine the teams that were in a playoff hunt. So, your Montreal, your Detroit, your New York Rangers, ostensibly your Islanders for a bit there, your Blue Jackets, did they play their starting goalie more in the second half of the season? Also interesting is, and I didn't, go through this because, again, I just didn't have the time, right? But the idea that, and this is, again, just based on like a quick scan of the data, is, do the Blue Jackets play more backup game? Like, do they play more backup goalies facing teams above them in the standings, right? So, and the answer is like, sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? Like, they didn't face Connor Hellebuck last season. I believe it was Eric Comrie. Both times they played Winnipeg. I know it was the first time The second time, they played Eric Comrie both times, right? They also played, but then on the other hand, they also played Anaheim's backup goalie both times. They lost both games, but and again, like Anaheim was another weird one because Lucas Dostal was the starting goalie because John Gibson was injured a bunch last season, but they played Gibson both times. They did not face Lucas Dostal, right? They faced, I believe they faced, usually it was 1-1, right? So like they faced the starter and the backup for San Jose. They faced the starter and the backup for Calgary. Toronto was an interesting one. They faced the backup all three times, which I thought was interesting. Two of those times was poor Dennis Hildeby, who got kind of thrown in. But like I thought it was really interesting that it's not necessarily that you play the backup of the bad team. Sorry, you play the backup of the good team and the starter of the bad team if you are kind of one of those mushy middle teams that the Blue Jackets were last season. But like for me, like genuinely the most interesting thing was, they did get more respect as the season went on. In the last like 20 games of the season, I think they only faced the backup goalie like 7 or 8 times. And a lot of that was kind of that 6-game win streak they went on. They only faced a starting goalie once in that time. So they faced 5 backups and then a starting goalie in those 6 wins that they had. But again, those were teams that had either made the playoffs and were resting or teams that were eliminated, right? So again, you've got to go into like there's a lot of ifs and buts here. But the short version of what this is yes, I do think the Blue Jackets were underestimated last year. I think they got more respect as the season went on. But I'll be really interested to see, and we'll talk about this in a second here, is will it happen again this year? Did the Blue Jackets overperforming with this roster mean that from the jump next season, will teams be throwing their starting goalies at the Blue Jackets more often than they were, a couple of seasons ago? And I would love to go back and do the data on this. Like I'm tracking it manually by hand, so it would take a million hours, but I would be really interested to know what the numbers looked like in, between like 2022 and 2024, right? When they were kind of miserably bad. But let's take a quick break. And then I want to talk a little bit about what this means for the upcoming season, right? Like, and where the Blue Jackets finished in the standings this year. Is that going to carry on? Or will it be a fresh start based on, a bunch of different things? So we'll take a quick break and then we'll talk about all of that in just a second here on Locked On Blue Jackets. First, I'm going to tell you about FanDuel. The NFL season is almost here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you're going to get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. This is a great deal, right? Like, all you got to do is go in, find literally the heaviest favorite you can. Like, bet on the Kansas City Chiefs to win a game, or bet on whatever you want, right? I've forgotten every football player, but like, put $5 on the heaviest bet you can find, and if it wins, you can get $300, and you can use that in whatever you want. You can put, these bonus bets on the Blue Jackets winning the cup, or potentially more of a surefire option. You can, I believe, they have the predictions for over/under point totals for teams. So, if I was you, I would maybe put some bucks on the Blue Jackets hitting the over on their over/under point total projections for the upcoming season. All of that good stuff, right? Are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, that's $300 in bonus bets that you're going to win as well. Welcome back to Locked On Blue Jackets. We are going to talk a little bit about next season now, but by that I mean, obviously, we've just spent a bunch of time looking at, yes, the Blue Jackets were underestimated by teams last year. Yes, they faced more backup goalies than starting goalies, just kind of overall, but especially towards the back half of the season. So What I think is going to be really interesting is, will this carry forward, right? Will the Blue Jackets continue to face more starting goalies? And, like, is this a good thing, right? Because I do think that there is power in being underestimated. And I do think the Blue Jackets took advantage of facing backup goalies, right? Like, again, I go back to 2 out of the 3 games against the Toronto Maple Leafs this year. They played Dennis Hildeby, who was their third string goalie, and they scored like 11 goals in those 2 games. I think they outscored the Leafs like 11-3 in those 2 games, right? Similarly, they managed to escape having to face, Connor Hellebuck at all this season. They played Eric Comrie both games against Winnipeg. They won one of those games, lost one of those games, right? So, you win some, you lose some, literally. But I think you can take advantage of things like this, right? Of if you don't have to play your Shesterkins, your Hellebucks, your et cetera, right? Like, on the flip side, I believe they faced Bobrovsky in 2 out of the 3 Florida games this season, and the Blue Jackets didn't score a goal on Sergei Bobrovsky this season. He shut them out both times that he faced them. So, like, it doesn't always work out that way, and I think, again, that's why you have to take advantage of winning games that you face again. Like, winning a game, if you're playing the backup, you have to win that game, right? Again, going into like last season for a second, I tracked how many wins they had against starting goalies and how many wins they had against backup goalies. And interestingly, it was about even. So it wasn't necessarily, I think, that the Blue Jackets took advantage, but more that, again, and probably again a state of the Blue Jackets were basically dead in the middle of the league for a lot of the season, right? Like, they basically hovered between 14th and 18th overall for a large part of the season. Of their 40 wins this season, 18 of them against starters, 19 of them against backups, and 3 of them against, again, what I'm calling tandem goalies. Which means that they had 21 losses to starting goalies, 20 losses to backup goalies, and 3 losses to tandem goalies. So, like, shockingly even, right? So I would expect, unless the Blue Jackets take another huge step forward, which I don't know that they will necessarily, you'd expect to see similar-ish numbers, right? Of about a 50-50 chance that you're going to face a backup goalie or a starter goalie. Now, I think what's going to be interesting is the NHL as a whole is always weird, right? And there's always teams that are way better than you expect or teams that are worse than you expect. But I feel like last year there were a lot more average teams than there were bottom feeders or, like, what quote unquote elite teams, right? Going to be a lot of those mushy middle guys, especially in the East. The East was real weird this year. The Calgary Flames finished with more points than both the Devils and the Ottawa Senators, missed the playoffs. The Devils were the 3rd seed in the Metro Division, right? So, like, I talked about it a little bit of, like, there's really only 2 teams that I think are going to be playoff locks in the Metro. And everything else is kind of up for grabs, right? So will it be another case this season of there are a lot of these mushy middle teams? Blue Jackets are just another one of those, or if they can kind of rise up out of that, are they going to get to a point where, you are going to face your Andrei Vasilevskis, which I believe that, again, like, speaking of Tampa Bay, I believe they only faced Vasilevsky once this season. I believe they faced the backup for the Lightning twice. So, again, it's on the one hand, it's nice to get respect, right? And it's nice to be like, yes, this team is, and especially when you get into things like back-to-backs, right? Of if, for example, a team faces the Blue Jackets on one night and the Red Wings on a second night, talking about the Red Wings as a team that should probably be hovering around about where the Blue Jackets are in the standings, that team is going to have to make a choice. Do you put your starter in against the Blue Jackets? Do you put your starter in against the Red Wings? Other factors? Is it a divisional matchup? When's your home game? When's your away game? Like, who's your home opponent, etc.? Who's on a hot streak right now? are the Blue Jackets more likely to, like, if the Blue Jackets are on a winning streak, they're also more likely to face a starting goalie. If they're on a losing streak, they're more likely to face a backup goalie, right? Again, I didn't do the exact numbers. This is mostly anecdotal, just kind of glancing. But when the Blue Jackets went on like the losing streaks, and they had a handful of 4-5 game losing streaks, they started seeing backup after backup after backup after backup. Conversely, when they started winning games, they also, they started facing more starter goalies, which again I think is interesting and like makes a lot of sense, right? But the problem is that, again, when you're a mushy middle team, and if you do kind of rise up out of that, is that the other teams start taking notice of you. And like, again, it comes down to, do you want to play Andrei Vasilevsky, or do you want to play whoever their backup is going to be this year? Like, do you want to face Connor Hellebuck, or do you want to face Eric Comrie, right? And like, the answer is you want to face Eric Comrie. So it's in the Blue Jackets' best interest to continue to be the underdog and continue to be underestimated, right? Not because that's kind of the coward's way necessarily, but that is just kind of like an easy win is an easy win, right? You don't want to face these tough goalies. The players will probably say that they do, because the players are, psychotic and always want the hardest. They want, to take the hardest possible route from A to B. But like, in theory, you want to face 82 backup goalies in a season, right? Because it just makes your life so much easier. And if going in that you're going to be facing, Dennis Hilderby, to give an example, for Toronto, or if you're going to be facing if you're going to be facing Danil Tarasov in Florida instead of Sergei Bobrovsky, because it looks like Tarasov's going to be the backup in Florida this season, you want to face Tarasov. Now that I've said that, he's going to be monstrous against us because the hockey is a stupid sport and also cursed. But your life is so much easier if you know that you don't have to go in and face Sergei Bobrovsky, right? Or Connor Hellebuck, or Anthony Stolarz, or Vasilevsky, or Shesterkin, or Jake Oettinger, or all of these goalies, right? And that's kind of, again, it's in your best interest to try and make yourself. I think you want to be underestimated. And again, they talk a big game about how they want some respect. And I do think that respect is an important thing to garner in this league. But also, like, if you're in a position where you can kind of just pretend to be a little guy and trick the other team into, throwing Kaapo Kähkönen out there against you, who I believe is going to be Montreal's backup this season, like, there's a lot to be said for tricking another team into giving you their second or third string goalie, taking the 2 points and running, right? How likely is that to happen, considering what the Blue Jackets did last season and what they've done so far in the offseason? Let's take another quick break and see if we can try and figure that out in just a second here on Locked On Blue Jackets. First, I've got to tell you about Monarch Money. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, investments, any of that. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. And that's why there is Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. And it's built for people with busy lives as well. If you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. It does all the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, and get smart categorization of your spending, so you finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Like, again, I talk about this all the time. Since I started using Monarch Money, I no longer have to go to my banking app and then a separate budgeting app and then a spreadsheet and then eventually giving up and writing it down on paper and then going back to my banking app. Like, I can do all of it through Monarch. And it keeps track of your spending as well, which is sometimes a good thing. And then sometimes you spend a long weekend in London going to a lot of places to eat a lot of food, and the app gets really mad at you for spending all of that money. But it's good to have, right? It's good that someone is keeping an eye on my bank account, because clearly I'm not. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for 50% off your first year. It's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Welcome back to Locked On Blue Jackets. We've talked a little bit about being underestimated, the importance of that, just how much the Blue Jackets were underestimated last season. And so I want to kind of just talk through what underestimation could look like for the Blue Jackets this season to kind of finish it off, right? The Blue Jackets are in a weird place right now. I do think, and I've talked about this at length on the podcast, so if you're in every day, this will be old news to you, but like the Blue Jackets improved this offseason, not in as big of a way as I wanted them to. I think as many fans wanted them to. You know, I think a lot of us had talked ourselves into that big splashy free agent forward. Or, you know, an exciting new defenseman who, you know, is potentially a better long-term fit for this team, etc. That didn't happen, but they improved the depth. The goaltending should be better this season if Jet Graves is the guy, TM. And, you know, they improved. On paper, this roster is better than last year, I think. Obviously, we won't know anything until you know, the season starts up and the games start being played. But the problem is, and this is also something I've talked about at length on this show, did the teams around them in the standings, the teams that were just ahead of them, like Montreal and Ottawa, or the teams that were just behind them, for example, you know, Detroit, the Rangers, the Islanders, etc., did they get more? Did they improve more than the Blue Jackets did? You know, are the Blue Jackets going to be left behind? And again, a lot of this really comes down to, are the Blue Jackets going to play? Are they going to overextend again this season? Because I do think they overperformed last season, right? Like they had red hot shooting all season long. We're going to see some regression, hopefully not that much. But is changing the goalie room a little bit, is shoring up the depth, is hopefully, knock on wood, getting everyone healthy and keeping them healthy, is fixing the special teams. You know, all of the stuff I've talked about this offseason as things for the Blue Jackets to do. Is all of that going to add up to a team that is on the higher end of the middle? You know, we're talking a wild card spot potentially. There are going to be more teams below you in the standings, right? And the more teams that are below you in the standings, the more likely you are, I feel, to get the starting goalie, because the odds are that, again, and this is kind of, Let's lay this out, right? Let's say, for example, the Blue Jackets are holding down that second wild card spot in the East. That means that there are 7 teams above them in the East. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that one of those teams is the Carolina Hurricanes. Carolina Hurricanes are in a position where they have the Blue Jackets one night, and let's say the New York Rangers, who are either the first wild card spot, or are, you know, like a point out of the playoffs and are on a real hot streak right now. Do you put your starting goalie against the Blue Jackets, or do you put your starting goalie against the Rangers, who are functionally identical teams, right? Like, what's the choice you make there? Especially, it's a divisional opponent. Both teams are basically exactly the same point in the standings. Like, and there are going to be a lot more of these conversations as you get higher up in the standings. In terms of, and by that I mean, like, there are going to be more options to steal 2 points from other teams than there are from you, right? If you are the 8th best team in the East, then there are 8 teams below you that probably a team is going to throw their backup goalie at. You know, if you're, again, for the sake of argument, let's say 14th in the league in that second wildcard spot, that means that there are going to be, math, I believe 18 teams below you in the standings for the other team to throw a backup goalie at. And again, try to steal 2 points from, you know, the Sharks, the Ducks, the Blackhawks, the teams that aren't going to be as good. My guess is that, for example, the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to face way more backup goalies this year than the Blue Jackets will, because the roster is terrible and the team is probably going to be bad, right? Yes, there's an extent of, you want to respect your Sidney Crosby, etc. But, like, at a certain point, the higher up in the standings you get, the more likely you are to face the starters because you're more of a threat to the other teams. And while that's fun, and while we want the Blue Jackets to be a threat to the other teams, right? Like us as fans, us as people following the team themselves, like they want the other team to take them seriously. But that does make your job a lot harder, and it is kind of like that vicious cycle of the better the team gets, the harder it's going to be to get better, and the better the team gets, the harder it's going to be to get better because you're going to be taken more seriously. You're not going to be, you see it all the time. Over the last couple of years, right? You're like, oh, they're playing the Sharks. That's a free 2 points. We won't talk about the fact that Vitek Vanacek put up 49 saves to beat the Blue Jackets last season, right? Or, you go in and you're like, oh, you're playing the Blackhawks. No, that's an easy 2 points. You're playing the Ducks of the past couple of years. Easy 2 points, over and over and over. You don't want to be a team that's an easy 2 points. But also on the flip side, like imagine how satisfying it was for Sharks fans to, again, they were miserably bad this year. They weren't as bad as they were last year, where they were, historically bad almost. But this year they were still pretty bad, still the worst team in the league. Like, how fun is it to go in, play a team that's much better than you? You've got your backup goalie in net, and win. It's a really fun way to win a game, right? And as the team gets better and better, which hopefully is the direction that they're going in, that's going to be a lot harder to achieve because teams are going to take you way more seriously. So I don't know how much the Blue Jackets are going to be underestimated this year. I think last year a lot of people sat up and took notice, and I think probably that will carry through at least for the first kind of like month of the season, right? Weird time. Everyone's kind of feeling things out. The Blue Jackets, I believe, are in 2 or 3 home openers before they get to their own home opener, which means that, there's straight up 2 or 3 starting goalies that you're going to face immediately because teams want to play their starting goalies for their home opener. That's how this works. So you're going to be fighting you're going to be, fighting an uphill battle, I think, if you're the Blue Jackets, especially if you do come out this season, if you carry on the way that you finished last season and come into this season red hot, teams are going to be like, oh, okay, well, we got to watch out for the Blue Jackets. And like, that's great. That's fun. Does make life a little bit harder. And I do think, again, if I sit down and do this at the end of next season, I do think the Blue Jackets will have faced a lot more starting goalies, especially if they do end up being a playoff team. I do think they're going to face a lot more starting goalies this upcoming year, which is a good thing. Because it means the teams are respecting you more, but it does mean that you are not, while still the underdog, probably for a lot of this, you're not going to be as underestimated, and you're not going to be seen as an easy win. And teams are going to try against you, which is kind of cool. But also sometimes it's fun to have a team be like, oh, it's only the Blue Jackets. We'll throw our third string goalie in and then do it again 2 months later for some reason, which is what Toronto did, is they threw their third string goalie at the Blue Jackets. They lost 7-4 or whatever it was. And then they did it again 2 months later, and the Blue Jackets beat the brakes off them again. Just a wild series of choices from the Maple Leafs. But overall, I think the Blue Jackets, I hope are better this year than they were last year. If they are better, they're probably not going to be as underestimated as they were last year, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Sometimes you can it really might depend on how strong of a start can they have to the season, right? If you can go in red hot and take teams by surprise, which again, I think the Blue Jackets did last season, then that's great. You get a little bit of a head start. So when teams catch up and realize, oh, actually, these are not a team to be screwed with, you have to show up against this team. It might, the Blue Jackets have built up a little bit of a buffer. So I love an underdog story, right? I think the Blue Jackets are probably going to be, the Blue Jackets could win the President's Cup and still, the President's Trophy, and still probably be considered the underdog because of small market problems. But for the most part, I do think the Blue Jackets are going to be way, not overestimated, but probably pretty correctly estimated this season. Which, like I said, is both a good thing and a bad thing. Thanks for listening to this episode, making it your first listen of the day every single day. We are going to have another episode on Friday for you. And then we've got 3 episodes next week, and then the week after that, we go back to 5 days a week, just as prospect tournaments and training camp, everything opens up, which is very, very exciting. Still trying to nail down a couple of guests for probably next week now. I don't think we'll have them by Friday unless I get a really fun email today. But thank you for listening, for making it your first listen of the day every single day. Locked On Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms and over on YouTube. Thank you for listening, and you can find me on Blue Sky at JAKOBFORSTER. You can find the show at LO_Blue Jacket. If you have comments, questions, criticisms, email me at lockedonbluejackets@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening, and until Friday, make sure you stay locked on.